Now on to row 3 of the rubric with examples from the 3 sample videos I asked you to review. And just to review one more time, rows 2 and 3 of the presentation and oral defense rubric at first glance might seem similar and therefore make it difficult for you to find evidence to score the work for these 2 rows. So let me clarify things again. As you just learned, row 2 is really about the line of reasoning that the student presents. We want to know whether or not students are presenting a conclusion which is comprised of an effective line of reasoning or claims backed with evidence generated via their proposed method, and not simply a report of what is already known via a review of the literature of the field. Students should be presenting the links between the evidence and claims that lead to the overarching conclusion, or they can present the overarching conclusion and then show how the claims and evidence flow from that. It's okay if they show this line of reasoning forwards or backwards. Row 3, however, is about students reflecting back on the process and how it affected their initial assumptions or hypotheses. The student should present how their initial assumptions led them to choose their method or approach, and how the conclusions made through the interpreted evidence affected their initial assumptions or hypotheses. This is a true reflecting back on the inquiry process. So, in effect, row 2 is about the line of reasoning, or the connection between the evidence, claims, and overarching conclusion, whereas row 3 is about reflecting back on the steps in the inquiry process affecting the initial assumptions or hypotheses. Okay, I'm glad we don't have to talk about that again. All right, let's look at the verbs, qualifiers, and conjunctions for the columns of row 3 of the rubric. For example, in the low column, the student must state a connection between their original assumption or hypothesis and their overall conclusion, something like, at first I thought this, and now I think that. But in order to move into the medium column, the student must describe the evidence that led to the affirmation or refutation of their initial thoughts pertaining to the topic of inquiry. For example, when I reviewed the results of my survey, I realized that ABC was significant in supporting what I already thought about my research question. In order for the presentation to cross over into the high column, in addition to describing evidence that supported or refuted their initial assumptions, it must explain how the steps in their research process led to this support or overturn of their initial thoughts on the subject. For example, my initial thoughts were X, so I decided to engage in a phenomenological study of ABC, and after reviewing the results of my observations and uncovering the following themes, I realized my initial assumptions were way off the mark as to what was really happening with ABC. So, in effect, the verbs for low, medium, and high columns are states, describes, and explains. But what about the conjunctions? Well, to move from low to medium, the presentations must move beyond stating an overgeneralized connection between initial thoughts and final conclusions to actually describing the evidence that led to this result in personal learning. This is an or situation. To move from medium to high, the presentation must move beyond just describing the evidence that led to personal learning to explaining the steps in the inquiry process or the choices being made with the method of data collection, organization, and interpretation that led to the development of one's personal conclusion. This is an and situation. Let me take a moment here to clarify what we mean by asking students to state or describe the connection between their initial assumptions or hypotheses and their personal learning as a result of the inquiry process. First, it would be nice if the students said the word hypothesis or assumption so that we could easily tell whether or not they're going to make a connection between such and the outcome of their research. But if they don't use these exact terms, please look for where they state what they thought the root cause was or the state of things were before implementing their research process. Please note that just stating their initial assumption or hypothesis is not going to get them any points on the rubric. To even get the lowest score on this row, the student must state a connection between their conclusion and their initial thoughts on the topic of inquiry. Row 3 is about the student reflecting on their research process as well as the learning that took place as a result. So, does the student state any connection between their initial assumption or hypothesis and the conclusion of their inquiry process? Or do they describe the evidence that led to this connection? Let's look at some examples. So, in the labor market video, The researcher states initial assumptions that the French government is doing very little to integrate African immigrants into French society, around time 9 minutes to 9 minutes and 20 seconds, and describes 3 different types of evidence to lead to his conclusion about the policies that the French government implements to support this initial assumption. He's very able to describe the evidence that he does have, regardless of the method, that supports his initial assumptions, and so he at least makes it to the medium column of this row. Compare that to the Comfort Women video. The overarching research question presented at time 4:49 is how comfort women should be taught in high schools. All we can glean from the presentation is that the student assumes the issue should be taught more. The evidence provided in the presentation addresses the extent to which the issue of comfort women is being taught, but does not address how it should be taught beyond the simplistic view of more. See, I told you so. So since we don't have any description of the evidence of how the comfort women issue should be taught, beyond the fact that it needs to be taught more, this is a simplistic connection between the student's initial assumption and the overall conclusion. You're left feeling, but how? You asked how it should be taught, and all you presented was more. This is a simplistic connection no matter what evidence was described. The student has not moved past the first block of this row. The next thing we're looking for is whether or not the presentation provides us with a description of the evidence that affirmed or refuted their initial assumptions, but also an explanation of the steps in the research process that guided their choice of method, interpretation of data, information, or evidence to lead to their conclusion, and how that reflected back on their original assumption. Here is where rows 2 and 3 start to intersect. In the alcohol abuse and commercials video, the student made strong and clear connections how current research in the field of alcohol abuse, commercial content, and DUIs influenced her choices in the research process, from how she chose her method, what content she would look at, what days she would use, and even how she would interpret that data. The student's initial assumptions are stated at around 245 to 328 as she walks us through the literature of the field, influencing her assumptions and her choices. She ties every step of her inquiry process to the formation of her conclusion from time 7:15 to around 10 minutes. And further, she describes her initial assumptions about future work that could be done with her research around 10:45, where she conjectures whether or not there will be a downward slope of the correlation of DUIs to number of commercials. Compare that to the labor market video. Although the presentation gives us the student's conclusions and a description of evidence that affirms or refutes the student's original assumptions or hypotheses, the presentation cannot move over into the high column because there's almost no description of how the researcher chose or interpreted the evidence to arrive at the conclusion. For example, what's the rationale for choosing the countries and the parameters that were analyzed? It's very unclear, at time 5:20. Such as, why is it important to choose Sweden because of its high score on the MIPEX at time 5:55, when all other variables similar to France are not similar at all? Additionally, the steps in running the statistical analyses on carefully chosen evidence from previous studies is completely missing and not explained. In this way, rows 2 and 3 are connected. 1, the conclusion is simplistic because the evidence doesn't emerge from a research-based method or process as required by the rubric. And second, the student is not able to provide an explanation of the connections from a research process to the conclusion reached and initial assumptions or hypotheses because a research-based method was not used. This is a common error that we see in many student samples where the student received a low on row 2 and a medium on row 3. In effect, rows 2 and 3 are the most complicated rows of the presentation and oral defense rubric, and they are connected sometimes, depending on whether or not the student actually engaged in a research method. So let's finish up these 2 rows with a summary of row 3. What we are looking for in row 3 is that the student can describe the connections between the evidence generated, whatever the method, the conclusion made, and the initial assumptions or hypotheses had at the beginning of the inquiry process. Remember, this is the reflecting back row of the presentation. Second, in addition to the first requirement, we're looking for whether or not the presentation provides us with an explanation of the steps in the capital R research process that led to the development of the student's conclusion. I've yet to see a 0 response for this row. The only way a student could earn a 0 here is if they never stated any initial assumption or hypotheses about the state of their inquiry topic, and every sample I've seen so far, the students at least achieve this element. Accordingly, low responses demonstrate a statement of a simple connection between the student's original thoughts on the topic of inquiry and the conclusion that they made. And it may not be in the same, like, part of the presentation. It may, they may have their initial assumption in the beginning and then have their final conclusion at the end, or they may say it all at once. Medium presentations have descriptions of evidence that lead to the student's conclusion and connect back to their original assumptions. However, high responses include an additional explanation of the research-based steps or processes in choosing, organizing, and interpret data, information, or evidence that help them develop their conclusion and address their original assumptions. All right, we just finished the hardest rows to score in our 7-row rubric. We are halfway home. Are you still with me? Anyone? Anyone? Bueller?